Tony Curtis, a youthful actor with the stunning good looks and captivating blue eyes, made his debut just as the Hollywood A-listers of the Golden Age were starting to make their names known. The fact that Curtis was more than skin deep became apparent to many admirers after a while. He joined the exclusive club of actors who have appeared in more than 100 films at the end of a career that spanned an impressive 60 years. He has great acting chops. While most of his loyal followers were blissfully ignorant of this, many fans saw Curtis as essentially the sweetie who became an idol. Everyone was in the dark about Curtis's very awful and terrifying shadow side. Here you will also be able to hear the facts. Arriving in Hollywood in 1948 at the age of 23, Curtis had no clue what California would do to him or what this new experience would deprive him of. Since he was naive about what that new adventure would entail, you may find some empathy with him. But he knew, as many others do, that he had to escape the horrible circumstances into which he had been born and the poverty into which he was thrust. Just to clarify, Curtis's parents were Jewish immigrants who escaped from Hungary. After a hard day of work, his parents would relax in the rear of the shop, even though they were unprofessional tailors who could only speak Hungarian. On top of all the problems that surface inside the family, Curtis's mother was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. Robert, Curtis's youngest brother, was also institutionalized due to a mental illness, making an already terrible situation much worse for the family. The family could hardly have received worse news. Things became much worse for this family. Curtis himself had to put off continuing his study due to his language barrier. When he and his brother Julius were 8 years old, their parents were unable to meet their dietary demands, thus they were placed in an orphanage for 1 month. An accident took the life of Curtis's brother Julius 4 years later. The young boy's death at the site was caused by a truck. At this same time, Curtis had decided to be on his own, had given up all hope, and was totally alone. Curtis's principal transgressions upon joining a local gang were not showing up to class and stealing. He had only recently entered puberty. It seemed like there was no way out of this existence he was living until a neighbor took a risk on the hurting boy. The neighbor was so kind that she took Curtis to a Boy Scout camp, the spot where the young man could channel his indignation and wrath towards something constructive. This move and the ensuing change in environment worked wonders, much to our relief. After Curtis got back after his time at camp, he found it much simpler to get back on his feet. This was the assurance that he could attend a public high school and get the basics that would give him a leg up in the world. However, he got more out of his time there than just a formal education. An early, tiny acting role came to Curtis when he was 16 years old, marking a turning point in his career. The part of the naive protagonist in a drama set in a settlement home was so significant to Curtis that he became bald in order to play the part. While waiting for his turn on stage, which took nearly 3 hours, he tried everything he could to keep his head warm. That was the degree of commitment he had to acting. The fact that it allowed the stage to pounce on him was perfectly fine with us. But Curtis enlisted in the Navy and was a submariner during WRR. This happened before he could go on his own professional journey. After the war ended, he was honorably discharged from the service. Acting, as you likely suspected, was the first thing he eagerly resumed. The acting profession was Curtis's sole hope, but he was clueless about how to launch his acting career. He tried to get into the profession by taking on all of the duties of a comic he'd met in the Navy and trying to emulate his success. He went to great lengths, even going so far as to consider Curtis his maid in the vain hope that this comic with a Hollywood connection would impart some acting wisdom and put him in touch with the right people. The acting classes were a total bust. Various sources also cite the comedian as having said that Curtis lacked any acting chops whatsoever. Curtis opted to take acting classes at New York City's New School for Social Research after failing the homemade courses. Some of his high school friends were also starting acting classes around the same time. While Curtis was a college student studying acting, he was discovered by Joyce Selznick, a famous casting director, talent agency, and niece of film producer David O. Selznick. While she did have trust in him, she still, perhaps because not even his alma mater believed in his abilities, Curtis doubted that he could make it big in Hollywood's entertainment industry. To paraphrase Curtis, I was 1,000,000 to 1 shot, the least likely to succeed. He believed he was inadequate. I was not at the bottom of the totem pole. I ended up in a sewer bound to a sack under the totem pole. More intriguing still, he admitted that, initially, all he cared about were women and money. While he was saying this, though, Curtis's biggest fear, returning to the Bronx as a failure and enduring the same poverty that tore his family apart, became immediately clear. Therefore, when Curtis faced the choice between performing or returning to the Bronx, he kept acting, regardless of the criticism he received. To get everything done, he had to play roles that had him standing behind the stage background, pulling ropes, or even taking the stage himself. For his acting roles, he would pretend to speak languages he did not actually know how to speak. In his view, it was better than returning to his house. In the event that he was unsuccessful in his job search, he applied for the part of Tarzan at 20th Century Fox. After having a quick look at his height, those individuals suggested him to improve his height by 8 inches before he returned. What a brutal approach. Eventually, Curtis was able to find another acting job with an off-Broadway group where he played some of the works of George Bernard Shaw. Eventually, Curtis was able to reap the benefits of his perseverance since he was able to perform at his maximum level in that particular situation. Additionally, the conversation about his potential drew the attention of an ambitious theatrical agency, who arranged for an interview to take place between Curtis and the chairman of Universal International Pictures, who was responsible for the Eastern region. Originally, when Curtis came to the Webster Words, he was looking for a home, whether it was a city or a village, and he was responsible for the Eastern region. As proof that the encounter was fruitful, consider Curtis's ability to land his first stock deal with a film firm. Also, without anyone batting an eye, a suit and a plane ticket to Hollywood were handed to Curtis. The chance to meet Jack Warner on the flight to California was a complete shock to him. It may not have served any purpose for Curtis at the moment, but in hindsight, some see it as a portent of his lifelong success. Conversely, Curtis had to give up part of who he was, like his name, in order to become great. Despite his Jewish background, strongly hinted at by his Jewish given name, Bernard Schwartz, Curtis had to overcome the difficulties of not having an American-sounding, easily remembered name. One of the many things he had to give up when he was about to launch a major career in Hollywood was his birth name. Curtis decided to become Anthony Adverse after hearing from the director of his debut picture that he was going to alter his name. The director, however, wasted no time in bringing this to his notice, telling him that the name was already famous in the field. Because of Anthony Curtis, Curtis had no choice but to give in. When he first arrived in Hollywood, he went by the name Anthony Curtis, and his studio had just one bed. His daily diet consisted solely of milk and pie. What were his alternatives? Not only was he struggling financially, but his low weekly income of $43 was adding insult to injury. Curtis did not act foolishly or stupidly, since he let himself be exploited and humiliated due to his innocence. Because he had an ingrained belief that he was inadequate, he merely maintained an attitude of eagerness to learn as much as possible. From where you were standing, he was certainly not ugly. This is why Curtis would paint a picture of my birthplace where beauty was compared to retrieving a passport from a trash can. But There were 15 men about Universal who were as good looking as I was, and they were all waiting for me to make a move. He found his ideal leveling ground during Hollywood's golden age. Additionally, despite the fact that he had been dealt a terrible hand early on in life, there were many other people whose stories were as inspiring. It seemed to him that he lacked any kind of explanation. At one point, Curtis was on the brink of returning to the Bronx, something he had vowed never to do, and quitting the entertainment profession altogether. A studio press representative approached Curtis as he waited for the first eastbound train to arrive at Union Station and spent some time encouraging him to keep going for what he wants out of life. This is the kind of situation for which Curtis would be eternally grateful. He appeared in 3 films after getting back into the workforce, each one featuring him using progressively less language. Nevertheless, an additional event was transpiring. The number of letters addressed to Curtis exceeded those of the stars in those flicks. He recalled that I had been a major player in cinema magazines, but that photographers could never capture me in an arresting pose. The opportunity to win a week with Tony Curtis was even part of the contests. It was like I was suddenly a prize. A woman in Terre Haute won me over after a week. Also, she said I was really into the gas burner when we got there. All of his efforts paid off in the end, as his 5th film was a smashing hit. Polite applause awaited the film's cast as they entered the stage for the procession. This happened at the film's premiere. The energy in the room changed drastically when Curtis, the final performer, came on stage. There were a lot of young women there, and they were all huge movie magazine readers. Seeing Curtis in person was an incredible opportunity for these ladies who had grown accustomed to seeing him in glossy magazines. Also, they stomped their feet and shouted as loud as they could to show how enthusiastic they were. They were on the verge of escalating the meet and greet into a full-blown riot. For Curtis, it was the same as stepping into an open furnace. The announcement caught everyone off guard, including the cast and the studio. Plus, who could possibly make them answer for their actions? When it came down to it, Curtis was really unimportant. He had received almost no reasonable screen time, and that was before you even considered building a fan base. His acting career was failing to pay the bills, so his studio decided to put him to work by having him grace the cover of their magazine. The studio saw this as an opportunity to put him to work while still making money. However, he stood on the brink of being encircled by admirers. Quickly getting over their first astonishment, the production firm set out to find a show that would feature Curtis as the lead. They also moved as fast as they could. The Prince Who Was a Thief was the perfect vehicle for their professional launch. This article showcased Curtis in all his masculine glory. And the plot wasn't overly complex either, so it wouldn't confuse the audience for whom it was made. A private dressing room was immediately made available to Curtis. Production of his film had cost around $200,000, and it made about $2 million because of his enormous celebrity. They were so lucky to have finally uncovered the money source that had eluded them for so long, the studio couldn't believe their good fortune. On top of that, they wasted no time getting the sequel to Curtis's film underway once they saw the flood of cash. From a business standpoint, this was also highly effective. People just liked seeing Curtis on screen, and that much was instantly apparent. Over the next several years, he starred in a slew of financially successful films, further solidifying his position as one of the era's emerging stars. Should I write S? The next logical step for Curtis was to meet with the powerful talent agency in Hollywood, which is why he is referred to as a rising star, a company that focuses on music. Here was the stamp that he used to officially announce his status in Hollywood. Conversely, Curtis and his colleagues realized there was room for improvement after 7 years at Universal. For Curtis's crew, he had the makings of an iconic Hollywood star on par with Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas and James Dean. The team took the first step. They put in a lot of time and effort looking out films where these big guys could star while keeping fitting Curtis, and it paid off. Over the next several years, Curtis co-starred with the big boys in a number of films, and he had the finest parts in each. He claimed that A-list actors and actresses had assumed the burden I was carrying. Among the greatest, I played a role. The guys knew it, but it didn't bother them because it gave them a chance to relax and save money, knowing that the kids would appreciate having me around. Curtis landed his own major motion picture thanks to the success of this smart concept. On top of that, his performance in The Defiant Ones earned him an Oscar nomination. He had already worked with Marilyn Monroe, who was among the world's most famous celebrities at the time, to produce the film Some Like It Hot the same year. Critically and commercially, the picture was a smashing success. Honestly, what were your expectations? Operation Petticoat was the zenith of Curtis's career. It allowed him to rejoin the Navy as a veteran and a famous actor, a perfect combination. At this same moment, he reached the pinnacle of his professional success. Comedies, dramas, military pictures, and more have all included Curtis. His work was something he was really proud of, and he was also quite adaptable. He may not have won an Oscar, but in 1960 he was inducted into the Hollywood Hall of Fame and given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The French government also presented him with the Order of Arts and Letters. At this point in his career, Curtis boldly stated, "Today I'm adjusted as a man and as a star, but in a way I'm still doing what I did when I was 7 or 8 years old, which was looking in the gutter for money. But now it's neither dirt nor cash. Those were its original uses. It is looking, to put it simply." Feeling down while reading those words? It's quite normal. You'll understand why when you read on. As Curtis's star began to rise, the actress Janet Leigh became the center of his attention. This was in the beginning of his rise to fame, which he had gotten because women fawned over him. Knowing the ins and outs of the film industry at the time, the studio knew that Curtis's budding career would be shattered if he became romantically involved with any lady. So for 3 days, the studio tried to convince Curtis not to get married by telling him he would be financially jeopardized if he did, even though they usually avoided getting involved in their actors' love relationships. They threatened to return him to the Bronx if it didn't work, ending his rapidly rising career. However, Curtis's infatuation with Leigh led him to defy the studio executive's orders and elope to Greenwich, Connecticut, to get married before a local judge. Sure enough, the studio had worried that Curtis's marriage would hurt his career, but he actually helped his career by becoming a master leaper after he tied the knot. They were the parents of Kelly and Jamie Lee, the couple's children. Still, after a decade of marriage, Curtis and Leigh filed for a dissolution of their marriage. There were whispers that Curtis had cheated with Christine Kaufman, a German actress who was only 17 years old when they split up, but he insisted that something else was the real reason. In his words, "We were the Hollywood A-list for a while. Not only was I very competent in my industry, but I was also really dedicated and committed to Janet." Still, she could see that her eyes' golden tone was starting to fade. "It finally hit me. Janet did not think I was good enough, regardless of who I was. My heart was crushed, and my body ached because of this." Those who would have agreed with him after he made this statement were pushed to reconsider their stance after Curtis wed Kaufman, who is now 18 years old, little more than a year after his divorce. His divorce with Kaufman was formalized 4 years later. By this point, Curtis's career had completely collapsed, and he was spending all of his time hanging around with complete and utter D-heads.